Falcon 9 just broke its own record. 165 launches, the best year any rocket has ever had. And yet, industry sources say SpaceX quietly told at least 9 major customers something strange. No bookings after 2028. No warning. No press release. Just silence. One rocket dominates the skies right now. The other, Starship Flight 13, is about to fly again as version 3 after fixing what nearly ended the last mission. 2 rockets, 1 future. Something has to give. Here's what's really happening. Let's start with what Flight 13 actually is. 2 rockets, stacked together. Super heavy on the bottom, 33 Raptor engines. Starship on top, 3 more. Together, they stand over 400 feet tall. That's taller than a 40-story building, lying on its side and then standing back up to fly. This is the second flight of Starship version 3, the design SpaceX is betting its entire future on. But here's the part the headlines missed. This script almost didn't get written this week because Flight 13 already tried to launch once. On July 16th, the countdown reached 0. Engines began to ignite. And then, nothing. An automatic hold, a scrub, at the very last second, with the rocket fully fueled and the world watching. Elon Musk came out shortly after and said 2 Raptor engines needed to be pulled and replaced before they'd try again. The new target, July 20th. Same date Apollo 11 landed on the moon, back in 1969. So, before we even get to Falcon 9, ask yourself this. If SpaceX can't get 36 engines to light cleanly on the pad, what happens when they need this rocket flying every single week? The Raptor problem. To understand why that scrub matters, you need to understand what went wrong on Flight 12, because it's the same family of problem showing up twice. Think of the 33 engines on Super Heavy like a marching band. If one musician comes in a half beat late, the audience barely notices. But rocket engines don't get graded on a curve. On Flight 12, one engine on the booster failed shortly after liftoff. That single failure triggered a chain reaction, other engines shutting down and restarting unevenly until the booster was lost right before it was supposed to land. Up top, one of Starship's 3 vacuum engines shut off after separation. The mission survived it, but SpaceX doesn't build rockets to barely survive. What most coverage skipped entirely is this. SpaceX didn't just patch the booster and hope. They changed the actual abort logic, the software rules that decide when an engine is failing versus when it just looks like it's failing during a violent multi-engine restart. That's a much harder problem than it sounds. 33 engines starting at once, all shaking the same frame, all interfering with each other's sensors. Telling a real failure apart from noise in real time at the edge of space is one of the hardest problems in the entire vehicle. And that's exactly the system that triggered the July 16th abort. The rocket's own computer saw something it didn't like, and it stopped the launch before a human ever had to make that call. In the old days of spaceflight, that kind of last-second abort would have been a 5-alarm crisis. Under SpaceX's philosophy, it's the safety system working exactly as designed. The uncomfortable question is which one of those 2 explanations is really true this time, and we won't know until engines are swapped and the rocket tries again on the 20th. While the engines get most of the attention, there's a quieter battle happening on Starship's skin, and it might matter even more for the vehicle's long-term future. Picture the heat shield as a suit of armor made of individual tiles, each one absorbing plasma hot enough to melt steel during re-entry. Lose too many tiles, or lose them in the wrong place, and the vehicle burns. On flights 10 and 11, SpaceX saw real oxidation damage, scorch marks that meant heat was getting places it shouldn't. Flight 12 was different. Oxidation was almost completely gone, and the ship survived re-entry all the way to splashdown in one piece. That's a real engineering win, and it's the reason SpaceX is now willing to add something unusual to Flight 13, tiles painted white. Now, plenty of people online assumed white meant a stronger, upgraded shield. It doesn't. SpaceX says these tiles serve 2 very different jobs. Some are placed to simulate missing tiles on purpose, essentially testing how much damage the ship can survive if the armor already has gaps. Others exist purely so a new set of camera-equipped satellites, riding along on this exact flight, can photograph the shield during the hottest part of re-entry and beam that footage back for engineers to study. So the real heat shield story on Flight 13 isn't really about Flight 13 at all. It's about generating enough data to eventually let SpaceX try something that's never been attempted at this scale, catching the ship out of the sky with mechanical arms, the same way they already catch the booster. Every coolant leak, every attachment method tested this flight is a data point on the road to that moment. The heat shield isn't the finish line. It's the entry fee for full reusability. The 30-minute countdown. There's one more piece of Flight 13 that almost nobody outside the industry appreciates, and it might actually be the most important number in this entire story because it's not about power, it's about speed. Older Starship flights, and pretty much every Falcon 9 mission before it, followed a familiar rhythm. Fueling would already be well underway by the time the public live stream even started, roughly 30 minutes before liftoff. Version 3 changes that math completely. SpaceX can now load close to 3,600 metric tons of propellant into both vehicles in about 30 minutes total, start to finish. Liquid oxygen begins flowing around the 37-minute mark before launch. Liquid methane follows a couple minutes later. Both tanks are topped off with barely 2 minutes left on the clock. Why does that matter for a story about retiring Falcon 9? Because rapid fueling isn't just a countdown trick. It's the difference between a rocket that can fly once a month and a rocket that can fly every single day. Falcon 9 already proved that reusable hardware plus a fast turnaround equals a launch cadence no expendable rocket could ever match. Starship's entire business case depends on doing the exact same thing, at a much larger scale, with a much bigger vehicle. If SpaceX can get version 3's ground systems this fast, this early in its life, that's a signal the company thinks daily Starship launches aren't a distant fantasy. They're a design target already being engineered into the hardware, flight by flight. One specific test on Flight 13 deserves its own spotlight because it's been promised before and quietly dropped before, and this time SpaceX doesn't really have the option to skip it again. Somewhere in orbit, after the payload doors open and the satellites are away, Starship is supposed to restart one of its own Raptor engines in the vacuum of space. That sounds almost routine until you think about what it actually requires. On the ground, gravity helps settle fuel at the bottom of a tank right where the engine needs it. In orbit, in freefall, propellant floats. There's no up or down to settle into. Getting fuel to flow reliably into an engine, then getting that engine to ignite cleanly in the cold vacuum of space, is a genuinely different physics problem than lighting an engine on a launch pad. This exact test was on the schedule for earlier flights and got skipped both times. It's back on Flight 13, and this time it's not just a nice to have. Every future version of this mission, refueling satellites already in orbit, deploying payloads to higher orbits, eventually sending vehicles toward the Moon and Mars, depends on proving an engine can restart in space on command every time, not just when conditions happen to be perfect. SpaceX has relit engines in orbit before on older Raptor hardware. This is a new generation of engine, built differently inside, which means the old success doesn't automatically carry over. It has to be proven again, from scratch, on this exact flight. The competition is watching too. It's worth zooming out for a second because this entire transition isn't happening in a vacuum. Competitively speaking, China's own orbital launch numbers grew from roughly 66 missions to around 90 in a single year, its fastest growth rate yet, and the country is actively building its own reusable rockets, along with massive satellite constellations of its own. Every month, SpaceX spends working through Starship's growing pains is a month a rival gets to shrink a lead that currently looks enormous, but isn't guaranteed to stay that way forever. Retiring the most productive rocket in history early only makes sense if the replacement shows up on time. If it doesn't, this stops being an internal SpaceX scheduling problem. It becomes a question of whether the United States keeps the launch dominance it currently holds almost unchallenged. Now here's where the story gets genuinely strange and where I want to slow down because the numbers don't add up the way you'd expect. In 2025, Falcon 9 flew 165 times. That's not a typo. 165 successful missions in a single calendar year, roughly one launch every 2.2 days, sustained for 12 straight months. That accounted for close to 85% of every orbital launch the United States performed last year, and nearly double the total output of China as an entire nation. 157 of those flights flew on boosters that had already flown before. This is, by any measure, the most dominant machine in the history of spaceflight. And SpaceX is walking away from it. Not today, not next year, but the rideshare bookings, the affordable shared launches that small satellite companies and universities depend on, are already being turned away for late 2028 and early 2029. Think of it the way airlines treat their own fleets. Carriers retire airplane models all the time, even wildly profitable ones, the moment a more efficient aircraft can do the same job for less money per seat. Nobody thinks that's crazy. They think it's business. Falcon 9 can carry roughly 25 tons to orbit on a good day. A fully reusable Starship is designed to carry over 100 tons, more than 4 times as much, and eventually at a lower cost per pound. Because unlike Falcon 9, which still throws away its upper stage every single flight, Starship is supposed to bring every single piece home. So the paradox isn't really a paradox once you follow the money. Falcon 9 isn't being retired because it's failing. It's being retired because SpaceX believes something bigger is coming that makes the old workhorse obsolete. The same way jet engines eventually made propeller planes obsolete, while those propeller planes were still flying just fine. The risk. Nobody wants to say out loud. But this is the part that should make you uneasy if you actually care about America's access to space. Because this exact move has been tried before, and it has not always gone well. United Launch Alliance tried to retire its older rockets in favor of a brand new design called Vulcan. The transition took years longer than planned. Europe tried the same thing, moving from Ariane 5 to Ariane 6, and hit the same wall, a multi-year gap, where the new rocket wasn't ready, and the old rocket was already winding down. Customers waited, costs went up, competitors got an opening they wouldn't have had otherwise. There's an even older parallel that nobody in the space community likes to bring up. When NASA retired the space shuttle in 2011, the plan was for commercial vehicles to be ready to pick up the slack almost immediately. They weren't. The United States spent close to a decade paying Russia for seats to its own space station, because the gap between retiring the old system and the new one being ready lasted far longer than anyone in charge admitted it would at the time. That is the real risk sitting underneath every confident statement SpaceX makes about Starship's timeline. Right now, in the summer of 2026, Starship has flown exactly 2 version 3 missions, and the most recent attempt at flight number 2 couldn't even get through engine ignition cleanly. Meanwhile, Falcon 9 is still the vehicle NASA and the military count on to keep national security payloads and crew missions flying, while its own company is already planning its retirement party. Moving too slowly costs SpaceX its lead. Moving too fast risks a shuttle-style gap in America's launch capability. There is no version of this transition where SpaceX gets to avoid that tension entirely. The only question is how well they manage it. There's a piece of this story that almost never gets mentioned anywhere, and it changes the entire picture. This isn't just a story about one rocket being better than another. It's a story about Falcon 9 physically running out of room to do its own most important job. Starlink is the reason Falcon 9 flies as often as it does. Over 12,000 Starlink satellites have now been launched, and more than 10,600 are still in orbit, with roughly 9,400 actively working right now. That first-generation constellation is essentially complete, but the next generation of Starlink satellites, the V3 design that Flight 13 is carrying for the very first time, is a completely different piece of hardware. It's bigger, heavier, more powerful, and built specifically around Starship's cargo capacity, not Falcon 9's. In other words, Falcon 9 isn't being retired just because Starship might eventually be cheaper. Falcon 9 is being retired because the next generation of SpaceX's own most important product literally does not fit inside it. You cannot stuff a car designed for a moving truck into the trunk of a sedan. The retirement of Falcon 9 was decided the moment engineers finalized the size of the Starlink 3 satellite bus. Everything else, the customer bookings, the rideshare cutoff dates, the drone ship reassignments, is just the schedule catching up to a decision that was already made on a design table years ago. That's why this transition feels rushed to outside observers, but probably doesn't feel rushed at all inside SpaceX. From the inside, this has been the plan the entire time. From the outside, it looks like abandoning a record-breaking rocket at the peak of its power for something that just scrubbed on the launch pad 4 days ago. Every strategy conversation about retiring a rocket early skips over one detail. Rockets don't build themselves. Falcon 9's production line in Hawthorne, California, runs on thousands of technicians who assemble, test, and refurbish these boosters full-time, month after month. A phased retirement doesn't happen with a memo. It happens by gradually shifting trained crews off Falcon 9 tooling and onto Starship's stainless steel assembly lines in Texas and Florida, one shift at a time. Get that pace wrong in either direction, and the cost isn't just measured in delayed launches. Move too fast, and you risk losing the exact expertise that made Falcon 9 the most reliable rocket ever built, right when Starship needs those same skilled hands the most. Move too slowly, and Starship never gets the workforce or the manufacturing floor space it needs to reach the flight rate. SpaceX is promising customers, somewhere in a factory right now, that balance is already being decided, quietly, one hiring plan at a time. Building toward the moment of truth. So this is where everything we've covered actually collides right now this week. SpaceX's own president, Gwynne Shotwell, has said publicly that Starship launches from Florida could begin only months after Flight 13 succeeds, not years, months. That single sentence tells you how much weight is riding on this specific mission actually working. A clean flight doesn't just validate one test. It potentially unlocks a second launch site, faster production, and the kind of flight cadence that would make Falcon 9's retirement look inevitable in hindsight instead of premature. A messy flight does the opposite. It hands ammunition to everyone comparing this transition to Vulcan, to Ariane 6, to the shuttle gap. It slows the argument for retiring Falcon 9 on schedule. And after an engine swap forced by a last-second abort on the pad, a messy flight is no longer a hypothetical outside possibility. It is sitting right there as a real option on July 20th. Every engine relight, every tile surviving re-entry, every satellite successfully deployed on this flight is being watched by more than just space enthusiasts. It's being watched by the customers deciding whether to trust Falcon 9's retirement timeline, by the military planning national security launches years in advance, and by every competitor hoping SpaceX stumbles at exactly the wrong moment. 2 rockets. One of them just shattered its own launch record and is being quietly phased out anyway. The other one aborted on the pad 4 days ago and is now carrying the weight of that entire decision on its back. Both rockets will tell us the truth soon. Thanks for analyzing this with me. I'm Adrian, the Space Brief. Like, share, comment, subscribe, and check the screen for more.